All right, so back for another class. Today we're going to go back to studying Maliki Yawmiddin. So last week we talked a lot about the first part of that, like I was just saying, Maliki, the owner of or the master of Yawmiddin, which is often translated as the Day of Judgment. And we talked about the word Malik, meaning from Malaka, Yamliku, Amliku, all the different variations, which basically mean to own or to control something. So the owner, the controller, the master of Yawmiddin. So so the word, let's start with the word deen. Let's look at a couple of the Arabic meanings for the word deen, because this is the word that is kind of like really interesting in this discussion, because the phrase is Yawmiddin, the day of ad-deen, right? And a lot of times when we translate deen, we mean it in terms of religion. But if we look at some of the root meanings of this word in Arabic, so for example, one of the meanings of it in Arabic is adhullu wal inqiyad, or to become subjugated and to submit, or subjugation and submission. Adhullu wal inqiyad. Okay, so what's interesting about this is if we connect this to another word in the Quran and in Arabic, which is spelled very similarly, right? But it's just slightly different, which is the word dain. Dain. So you have a deen and you have the word ad-deen. So what's the difference? The word ad-deen means debt. Like when you contract a debt, like when you borrow money, right? When you get a loan, we call it dain. You get a dain, okay? And then you have the word deen, which is the one that we usually translate as submission. What's the connection between those two words? That's something interesting to
Sorry,
think about.
can
Go
you
ahead.
spell it for me?
Spell
Difference, because my ears can't tell the difference.
okay, no. I'm glad you asked. I will. I will. So Dane, if I use just English letters, I would spell it Dayn. Dane. And the word Dean, I would spell Deen. Dane and Dean. Does that make sense? I'm trying to, let me see. I should have a messaging thing here somewhere.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Um, so so Dane, Dayn, Dane, right, means debt. And Deen is the word that we usually translate as submission. Okay? Or I'm sorry, as religion is what I meant to say. But the root meaning, so in all of our classes, we always try to go back to the root meaning of the word. So the root meaning that connects both of those words together is to become subjugated and submission. Okay? Now, how those two things fit together, actually, the word for debts or Dayn, Dayn, I believe will really help us understand the word deen. Okay? That's often translated as religion. Because a Dayn, if we think about the idea of a debt, if you contract a debt, what's involved with contracting that debt? So, for example, if you look at in the Quran in chapter 2, in what's known as the longest ayah in the Quran. So this is the longest verse in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 282. This is the longest verse in the Quran. And it's all about debt. It's all about contracting a debt. So it says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, idha tadayantum bidaynin, excuse me, O you who have believed, when you contract a debt, when you contract a dain, ila ajalin musamma, to a prescribed time period, faktubu, then write it down. وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ, and let a scribe write between you with justice. And then he gives us this whole long ayah about everything connected to contracting a debt. So a debt is, we see from this verse, is a contract, is an obligation, right? It's something that requires witnesses. It requires to write it down. So there's a lot that goes with the idea of a debt or a dain. So that lines up with the Arabic meaning of these words, which is adhullu wal inqiyad, to become subjugated or to submit to something. Because when you contract a debt, you are submitting to certain conditions. So if you go to say like for to a bank, for example, or just someone one on one, privately loaning you something, right? There's going to be certain conditions as the verse outlines, right? That you're supposed to write it down. It's supposed to be ajalin musamma, to a known time period. So there's going to be conditions, right? You're going to say you're going to pay me this amount of money back at this particular time, etc. There's going to be certain conditions that you willingly accept and submit to, right? So that's why part of the root meaning of dain for debts and deen, that's translated as religion, has the meaning of submission, because there are guidelines, there are rules, there are procedures that you accept and you submit to, and you agree that you will hold yourself to these guidelines. Does that make sense? Is everybody clear on that, or is there any questions about that?
Yes, sir.
So that's a little bit about why the words are so similar. The only difference in the word is just one vowel. So dain is the da, the a vowel, and the deen is the di or the de. So it's just a difference in one vowel, but otherwise the words are spelled exactly the same. Debt and the word that we often translate as religion. So ad-deen is a set of laws, principles, procedures that you submit to, that you agree to comply with. Okay, and that's why I think we talked a little bit about this verse last week, but I want to bring it up again because it's relevant here. That's why in Surah Yusuf, he says in verse 76, so chapter 12, verse 76, he says, ما كان ليأخذ أخاه في دين الملك إلا أن يشاء الله. He was not able to take his brother, excuse me, he was not able to take his brother according to the law of the king, في دين الملك إلا أن يشاء Allah, except that Allah willed. So he was not able to take his brother according to the law of the king. Now, how do they translate, or what's not translate, but what's the Arabic for the law of the king? Deen al-Malik. Deen. So he uses here for the law of the king, the law of the land that the king has put into effect, that everyone of that land has to comply with and submit to, is called Deen. Deen al-Malik. And it's interesting that the connection of these words, like look here how it's called Deen al-Malik, the law of the king. And in Surah Al-Fatiha that we're studying, he says Maliki yawm, that he owns or controls the day of ad-deen, the day of the actualization of the laws and the principles that we're supposed to abide by. So that's a couple things about just the Arabic meaning of it. Another thing is, some of us might be familiar with the term Medina, right? A lot of us might be familiar with that term just because of the popularity of the city Medina in Saudi Arabia. So we have Medina and Mecca. So we are familiar with the word Medina. But the word Medina in the Quran is not just in reference to a specific place. So like now in just modern or popular conversation, when we refer to Medina, usually we mean the city in Saudi Arabia. But if you look in the Quran, it doesn't just refer to that. And in fact, the reason that probably is because when that was named, it was called Medina to Nabi, the city of the Prophet. And then it just became known as Al-Medina, right? But the word Medina itself just means a city, Medina. Okay? But why is it called Medina? That's what I want to talk about. Notice how it sounds very close to the word for religion that we've been talking about. Deen, Medina, right? That's because they're from the same root word. So Medina, I was just trying to look at some of the verses real quick to see how many times it is in the Quran. For some reason, I can't find it. I don't know why. But I will in a second, inshallah. So the word Medina in the Quran is just in reference to a city. So, for example, it looks like it's used about 14 times in the singular and 3 times in the plural. So 17 times total. But for example, we see Fir'aun in the story of Fir'aun or Pharaoh, when he was talking to Musa, he said, Inna hadha la makrun makartumuhu fil medinati litukhriju minha ahlaha. He said, this is a plot that you have plotted in al-Medina, in the city, in order to expel from it its people. Okay? And we see in the story of Yusuf, وَقَالَ نِسْوَةٌ فِي الْمَدِينَةِ, and the women in the city said. We see in the story of Lut, it says, وَجَاءَ أَهْلُ الْمَدِينَةِ يَسْتَبْشِرُونَ, that the people of the city came rejoicing. In the story of Ashab al-Kahf, or the companions of the cave, فَبَعَثُوا أَحَدَكُمْ بِوَرِقِكُمْ هَذِهِ إِلَى الْمَدِينَةِ, then send one of you with this money of yours to al-Medina, to the city. So you can see quite a few examples in the Quran that the word al-Medina, it's just a reference to a city. It's not necessarily a reference to a specific city, even though now in our popular discourse or popular conversation, it's become used mostly for Medina to Nabi, the city of the Prophet in Saudi Arabia. Now, why I'm mentioning this in our study of the word deen is because why is it called Medina? Why is it called Medina? Perhaps, and Allah knows best, because a Medina, because in the Quran, also another point, in the Quran, you have another word for a community or a town, or different words we can translate it into English, which is qarya. So we have Medina and we have qarya. These are two different words for a city or a town in the Quran. And maybe in some of our other classes we can discuss in more detail the difference between them. But one of the differences between them is that the Medina, why it's called a Medina, is it's the place where the law is implemented. The place where the law, the origin of the law of that land. So perhaps, potentially, we could say, maybe in the US, I don't know what it would be for UK, but in the US, we would say maybe like Washington is the Medina, Washington, D.C., because that's the place of the law, right? The capital in the capital city in whatever state we're in, perhaps we can say that's the Medina of that state because it's the place of the law, right? But a place like, say, like New York, right? Maybe that would be a qarya because it's a town, it's a community. Even perhaps we can say something like that. We can use the phrase in the Quran where it says Ummul Qura, the mother of the towns, right? Because the mother of the towns is where everything else comes from, right? It's where everything revolves around. It's where people go to. So maybe a place like New York in the US, like I said, I don't know exactly what that would be for UK, but maybe we wouldn't consider that a Medina because that's not necessarily the place where the law is being established, but it's like Ummul Qura, it's like the mother of all the towns. Perhaps, and that's something we can discuss more and think about it more. I'm just giving some examples of potentially how we can look at these words just to show the difference between them. Why is it called a Medina? Is because it's a place where the law, it's the center of the law. It's where the law is being established in that place. So it's called Medina. So when you look at these different words, dayn for debt, D-A-Y-N, deen, D-E-E-N, and you look at Medina, right, you see a connection in meaning between them in the sense of a certain set of laws and principles and procedures that have to be submitted to and adhered to. So now Allah refers to, so another interesting study I was thinking about as I was preparing for this class Another interesting study would be, and someone may have done this already, but it would be interesting to study it from a fresh perspective, is to take all the different names that Allah has given to the Day of Judgment. Like he said, things like Yawm al-Qiyamah, for example. Qiyamah comes from standing. So the Day of Judgment is how they would usually translate it, but the word is Qiyamah, standing. Yawm al-Taghabun, the Day of Taghabun. Various different names that is given throughout the Quran, right? And it would be interesting to take each of those names and do a complete study of what is the significance and why is it called by so many different names. But one of those names that we find in the Quran, and we find in Al-Fatiha, which is where we're studying today, is Yawmuddin. Yawmuddin. The day of ad-deen. Okay? So this phrase, Yawmuddin, it's in the Quran 13 times. So the phrase Yawmuddin that's in Al-Fatiha is in the Quran as a whole 13 times. Excuse me. And the surah that this phrase Yawmuddin is in the most, that we find it the most times, is in Surah 82. And I think that's a really good surah to give us a lot of important meanings about this phrase. So I'm going to save that for last, but I want to read these other verses really quickly that use the phrase Yawmuddin. So number one is in Al-Fatiha, the one that we're reading. So that's the first one, Maliki Yawmuddin. The second one is going to be in 1535. So in 1535, let's go to 1535. He says, and this is in reference to now Iblis. He says, وَإِنَّ عَلَيْكَ اللَّعْنَةَ إِلَى يَوْمِ الدِّينِ, that upon you is the curse until يوم الدين, until the day of ad-deen. قَالَ رَبِّي فَأَنذِرْنِي إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. He said, my Lord, so postpone me or give me respite until the day when they are yub'athun, when they are resurrected or sent forth. قَالَ فَإِنَّكَ مِنَ الْمُنْظَرِينَ. He said, then you are from amongst those who have been postponed إِلَى يَوْمِ الْوَقْتِ الْمَعْلُومِ, until the day of a known time. الْوَقْتِ الْمَعْلُوم, sorry, a known time. So here, in connection with the phrase Yawm ad-Din, we find a couple different facts. We find, number one, that it's connected with Yawm Yub'athun, the day that when they will be sent forth. And it's also connected with the phrase Yawm al-Waqt al-Ma'lum, the day of the known time. Okay, so that's the second place. The third place is in 2682. So the third place is in 2682. 2682, this is the statement of Ibrahim. So Ibrahim says, وَالَّذِي أَطْمَعُ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ لِي خَطِيئَتِي يَوْمَ الدِّينِ, the one that I hope will forgive my sins on Yawm ad-Din, the day of ad-Din. Now what's interesting about this place here, 2682, in the discussion of Ibrahim, if you recall, when we talked about the phrase Rabbul Alameen, we referenced this place, but I want to remind, because it's been probably a couple weeks since we talked about that. Here, Ibrahim in verse 77 uses the phrase Rabbil Alameen. فَإِنَّهُمْ عَدُوٌّ لِي إِلَّا رَبَّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Then they are all enemies to me. He's talking to his people. He's telling his people, whatever you used to worship, whatever you worship besides Allah, are all enemies to me except for Rabbil Alameen. And then he goes through few descriptions of Rabbul Alameen, and then it comes to verse 82 where he says, وَالَّذِي أَطْمَعُ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ لِي خَطِيئَتِي يَوْمَ الدِّينِ, and the one that I hope will forgive my sins Yawm ad-Din. So it's interesting here in the story of Ibrahim that he uses both phrases that are also present in Al-Fatiha, the surah that we're currently studying. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawm ad-Din. And here he says Rabbil Alameen, And then he comes down to saying, the one that I hope will forgive my sins, yawm ad-deen, on the day of ad-deen. And then if we keep reading, skip a few verses, but then he says, وَلَا تُخْزِنِي يَوْمَ يُبْعَثُونَ, and do not humiliate me on the day when they are resurrected or sent forth. So remember that same phrase, yub'athun, was used in the last verse where we looked at Yawmuddin and what's connected to it in that context, right? So in the previous verse that we looked at, right after Yawmuddin came this same phrase, Yawm Yub'athun, the day when they are brought forth or resurrected. So potentially that shows that there's a connection between those two ideas. And then he describes it more by saying, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ, the day when no wealth or children will benefit, إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, except for the one who comes to Allah with a sound heart. With a sound heart. So another characteristic that we learn about Yawmuddin here is that it's a day when wealth and children don't benefit. So people think to have material possessions or to have a lot of children, that's necessarily in and of itself a good thing. It could be a good thing depending on how we approach it, right? But I think the way that the Quran discusses that is really beautiful to me, because it talks about, for example, innama amwalukum wa awladukum fitna, in another verse, that your wealth and your children are a trial, right? So it could be a good thing, right? It's a trial. Just like any other blessing that you're given is a trial. It could be a good thing and it could work against you. It just depends on how you approach it, right? And I think that's really beautiful, because not everyone has wealth and not everyone has children. So when people make those things as if these in and of themselves are inherently good, in the sense of, if you have that, you're better off than another person who doesn't have that. Then what about people who, for whatever reason, can't have those things? They can't have wealth, they can't have children. Then how does that make them feel? And I remember one time, just to show, I think, like, how far that we sometimes go from the Quranic discussion of certain things, that I remember I was listening to a khutbah one time in a masjid, and the brother was giving a whole talk about how much children are a blessing, and not negating what he was saying, because I get where he's coming from, but it's interesting to me that the Quran presents that in a different way, because I was thinking as he was talking, I wonder how people feel who don't have kids or can't have kids or don't want kids, whatever the case might be, right? I wonder how they are listening to this khutbah and hearing that, how that's hitting them. Whereas the way the Quran presents it is really interesting, that the Quran doesn't necessarily present it like it's good or bad. It just is. Like, if Allah gives you these things, then it's what you do with it. If you raise good kids and they're, you do good things and they do good things, and you approach it, or at least you try to raise good kids. Like, you can't always even control how that comes out, because my mother tried her best to raise me, and I still went in a bad direction for a while. Alhamdulillah, Allah brought me back. But my point being is, like, the test is, you have these blessings. What do you do with them, right? Are you grateful for them? Do you try to use them in the best way? But whether or not you have the blessing or not doesn't make you a better person than someone else. So that's why I like how the Quran presents these things. So it's really interesting that in connection with this phrase, Yawmuddin, Ibrahim here references this as Yawma la yanfa'u malun wala banun. This is a day when no wealth or children will benefit you. Illa man ata Allah biqalbin salim, except for the one who comes to Allah with a sound heart. So, meaning, Allah knows best, or at least the way I take it, your wealth and children can benefit you if you come to Allah with a sound heart. So, meaning, you had these blessings and you use them in the right way. You approach them in the right way. So that's the second place, or the third place, sorry, that mentions Yawmuddin. 3720 is the fourth place. So 3720, and like I said, 82, chapter 82, I'll save that for the end, because that has the most mentions of the phrase Yawmuddin. So 37:20, he says, فَإِنَّمَا هِيَ زَجْرَةٌ وَاحِدَةٌ فَإِذَا هُمْ يَنْظُرُونَ, that it is only one zajra. Now, I need to study that word a little bit because I don't remember completely the meaning of zajra. I know some of the meaning in Arabic. Zajara, it could mean to rebuke or to censor or something like that. But in the context of the Day of Judgment, what does he mean here? That it is only one zajra. فَإِذَا هُمْ يَنْظُرُونَ, and they are looking. وَقَالُوا, and they say, يَا وَيْلَنَا هَذَا يَوْمُ الدِّينِ, they will say, woe to us, this is Yawmuddin. هَذَا يَوْمُ الْفَصْلِ الَّذِي كُنْتُمْ بِهِ تُكَذِّبُونَ, this is the day of Fasl. So they might translate this as the day of decision, the day of determination, but the word Fasl literally means to separate. This is the day of separation, where everything will be separated. That's maybe why, if I'm remembering correctly, but let me double check that. 37:21, I think they translate that as the day of decree or something of that nature. Let me see how he translates this. 37:21. He just says the day of judgment, but I think that's a little too generic, because you can translate any of those phrases that we've been talking about as the day of judgment, but he specifically uses the word fasl, meaning to separate. Yeah, in both cases here they translate as the day of judgment. I thought they were going to use a different word, but they say hada yawmul fasli, this is the day of separation, alladhi kuntum bihi tukadhibun, which you used to deny. So potentially, like, the day of separation could be separating truth from falsehood. It's going to separate the good people from the bad people. It's the day of separation, and that's connected with Yawmuddin. And remember, deen means the laws, right? The laws, the principles, the procedures. So what really separates people is the adherence to these principles and laws, whether we're talking about the moral laws that Allah gives us and has instilled in us, whether we're talking about the laws of the universe potentially. The deen is the set of principles and laws. The next place that it mentions this is in 38:78. So in 38:78, he says, and this is again about Iblis. So it's a very similar verse to what we read in the second verse that we read, where he says, وَإِنَّ عَلَيْكَ لَعْنَتِي إِلَى يَوْمِ الدِّينِ, and upon you is my curse until يَوْمِ الدِّينِ. قَالَ رَبِّ فَأَنذِرْنِي إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. He said, my Lord, so postpone me until the day that they are yub'athun, that they are sent forth or resurrected. قَالَ فَإِنَّكَ مِنَ الْمُنذَرِينَ. He said, you are amongst those who are postponed, إِلَى يَوْمِ الْوَقْتِ الْمَعْلُومِ, until the day of the known time. So again, we find those same concepts. Yawm yub'athun, the day when they are sent forth, and Yawm al-waqt al-ma'lum, the day of the known time. We find those same concepts connected with Yawmuddin. 51:12 is another verse that mentions this. So 51:12, he says, قُتِلَ الْخَرَّاسُونَ قُتِلَ الْخَرَّاسُونَ. This is a really interesting phrase. قُتِلَ الْخَرَّاسُونَ. 51:12. What's a good way to translate that? So, first of all, the word qutila. So the word qutila. That's 10, verse 10. They say perish. Yeah, I guess you could say that. So qutila means basically to be killed, right? But see, this is a good example of why that word, when we see it in the Quran, when people read verses that say kill or fight, it doesn't necessarily mean physically, because this word is sometimes used with people who have certain qualities, and it's used in a way of saying, like, may they be may they be gone, like may they be done with, or may they be minimized, right? Qutila. Qutila al-kharras, that's why he says perish, right? But it's not necessarily just talking about physically, but it's saying like the word qutila, qatala, I think I've talked about this in other classes, is very close to the word qalla. Qalla means to minimize or to lessen something. So when we say qatala, which is often translated as to fight, qatala could be to struggle against something negative in order to minimize the negativity, right? It doesn't necessarily just mean physically. So when we say qutila in the Quran, there's different qualities that people have that are considered to be bad qualities, and Allah will say qutila. So they might translate that as may they be perished or may they be killed, but meaning Allah knows best, may these qualities or the people who have these qualities be minimized, right? So qutila al-kharrasun, al-kharrasun. The al-kharrasun from kharasa means basically like to guess or to speculate. So those people who just guess and speculate without knowledge, may that quality be minimized. الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي غَمْرَةٍ سَاهُونَ. Those who are like heedless, fi ghamra, like drowning in heedlessness. يَسْأَلُونَ أَيَّانَ يَوْمُ الدِّينِ. They ask, when is Yawmuddin? So this particular place just presents their perspective as far as like them asking when is Yawmuddin. Another place in the Quran that mentions this term is in chapter 56, verse 56. So 56:56, he says, 56:56, هذا نزلهم يوم الدين. So he's talking about certain people here. Like this is their enjoyment or something of that nature, Yawmuddin, on the day of judgment. He's talking about certain people that we would consider to be like bad people. So it's a description of what they have at that time. Or they say such will be their welcome on the day of Deen. Another place is chapter 70, verse 26. So 70, verse 26. Let me find that really quickly. 70, that's Ma'arij, verse 26. Okay, let's see here. So here he says, he's talking about here, the people that are referred to as al-musallin are those people who make salah, right? So he says, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ خُلِقَ هَلُوعًا إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ الْخَيْرُ مَنُوعًا إِلَّا الْمُصَلِّينَ. That the human being was created in a state of anxiety. إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا. If bad touches him, he becomes really impatient, falls apart. وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ الْخَيْرُ مَنُوعًا. And when good touches him, he becomes manu'an. He prevents and refrains and refuses to give things. He withholds. إِلَّا الْمُصَلِّينَ. He said, except for those who make salah. الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَلَى صَلَاتِهِمْ دَائِمُونَ. Those who are continuous upon their salah. وَالَّذِينَ فِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ مَعْلُومٌ. And those who there is a known right in their wealth. لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ. For those who ask and for those who have been prevented. وَالَّذِينَ يُصَدِّقُونَ بِيَوْمِ الدِّينِ. And those who do tasdeeq, they affirm the truthfulness of yawm ad-deen, of the day of ad-deen, the day when these laws, principles, and procedures will be actualized. So part of the description of al-musallin, those who do salah, is those who have who affirm the truth of yawm ad-deen. And that's interesting because look at how well the verses of the Quran fit together. Because here, وَالَّذِينَ يُصَدِّقُونَ بِيَوْمِ الدِّينِ, those who do tasdeeq or affirm the truthfulness of yawm ad-deen, is connected to the quality of al-musallin. Now, if we go to verse or chapter 74, look at the opposite, right? So about the mujrimeen, loosely translated as the criminals, right? It talks about ashabul yamin, the companions of al yamin, fi jannatin yatasa'alun, in gardens asking one another, anil mujrimeen, about the criminals, ma salakakum fi saqar, what has caused you to dwell in the blazing fire? قالوا لم نكن من المصلين. They say, we were not amongst al-musallin. وَلَمْ نُطْعِمُ الْمِسْكِينَ وَلَمْ نَكُنْ نُطْعِمُ الْمِسْكِينَ. And we didn't used to feed the poor people. وَكُنَّا نَخُوضُ مَعَ الْخَائِدِينَ. And we used to discuss vainly with those who discuss vainly. وَكُنَّا نُكَذِّبُ بِيَوْمِ الدِّينِ. And we used to deny يَوْمِ الدِّينِ. Yawmuddin, the day of recompense, or the day of ad-deen, the day of the laws and the principles, right? So look at how beautifully like the Quran fits together. In one place, it says illa al-musallin, except for those who do salah, and one of their characteristics is walladhina yusaddiquna biyawmiddin, those who affirm the truthfulness of yawmiddin. And here they say about the mujrimeen, the criminals, lam naku min al musallin. We weren't from the musallin, those who do salah. And so what was one of their qualities? Wa kunna nukadhibu bi yawmiddin, the opposite. We used to deny yawmiddin, the day of ad-deen. And then I'm going to skip 82 for 1 second and go to 83. So, and then I'm going to go back to 82 because that's the place where it's mentioned the most. So I want to focus on that in the conclusion of our class, because I think that really 82 really kind of sums everything up. So in 83, in verse 11, he says, he's talking about those who deny. Waylun yawma idhin lil mukaththibin. Woe on that day to those who deny. Alladhina yukaththibuna bi yawmiddin. Those who deny yawmiddin, those who deny the day of ad-deen. وَمَا يُكَذِّبُ بِهِ إِلَّا كُلُّ مُعْتَدٍ أَثِيمٍ. And none denies it except for every transgressing, sinful person. So I also think that's beautiful, because now it also connects the idea of the one who denies Yawmuddin is everyone who is mu'tad and athim, transgressing. So they want to go beyond the laws and principles, and athim. So they want to, the sinful is usually how that's translated, but from the word itham. So itham, which is often translated as sin, itham, and athim is the one who does itham. Itham in Arabic, it's interesting that the root of the meaning in Arabic means to be slow or to be delayed. So I think a deeper, more universal way of thinking of the word itham, because when you use the word sin, it only gives you like this the connotations of like just a religious experience, right? But if you think about it, like in a really narrow sense is what I mean. But if you think about it from the root meaning in Arabic, itham meaning to be slow or to be delayed, then itham is any quality, any bad quality that slows down your growth, right? So ad-deen, right, the laws and the principles that Allah has established are laws and principles that are conducive to our growth. It's going to help us grow. So the one that denies yawmiddin, the day of ad-deen, is kullu mu'tadin athim, every transgressor. So they want to go beyond the laws and principles. And athim, the one who, because of not adhering to the laws and principles, it slows down their growth and their progress in life. So now I want to conclude with the 3 verses in chapter 82 that use this phrase Yawmuddin, because I think these kind of sum up everything. And in fact, the surah as a whole probably does. So if we look at this surah, he says, starting from verse 6, he says, Ya ayyuhal insanu ma gharraka bi rabbika al-kareem. O human being, what has caused you to be deceived about your Lord, who is Al-Karim, who is generous and honorable? الذي خلقك فسواك فعدلك, the one who created you and proportioned you and balanced you. في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك, in whatever shape he chose to construct you. كلا بل تكذبون بالدين, nay, rather, you deny ad-deen. Ad-deen. So I think it's really interesting here. So he didn't use the phrase yawmuddin yet. It's coming up. But he used the word ad-deen, that you deny ad-deen. But look at the context that he used it in. He used it right after talking about the creation of the human being and how the human being was created in a way that he was proportioned. Adala, he balanced you, equalized you. في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك, in whatever shape he wanted to construct you, so he constructed you. So after talking about like this meticulous way of constructing the human being, and if we study the human body, we know the human body is constructed in this very amazing, fascinating way, right? Where everything is based on laws and principles and organized in a certain way to make the whole organism function, right? And right after that, in verse 9, he says, rather, you deny ad-deen. You deny ad-deen. You deny the idea that everything functions according to set like laws and principles. Perhaps that's one way to think about it. وَإِنَّ عَلَيْكُمْ لَحَافِظِينَ, and there are guards over you, kiraman katibin, honorable scribes, يَعْلَمُونَ مَا تَفْعَلُونَ, they know or are aware of what you are doing. So actions, if you follow the sequence, our actions are connected to the idea of ad-deen, the idea of like living according to these laws and principles. Then he says, Innal abrara lafi na'im, the righteous are in na'im, are in delight, in glory. Wa innal fujjara lafi jahim, and the corrupt are in jahim, are in the burning fire. So the righteous are in na'im, in delight, and the corrupt are in jahim. Then he says, yaslawnaha yawm ad-din, they will enter it yawm ad-din, on the day of ad-din. وَمَا هُمْ عَنْهَا بِغَائِبِينَ, and they will not be absent from it. Now, in the end of the surah, he's actually going to define what is Yawmuddin. That's why I saved this for last, because I wanted to show you all the different places it was used, but then save this for last because in this surah, he gives a definition of Yawmuddin. He says, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا يَوْمُ, and what will make you know what is Yawmuddin? ثُمَّ مَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا يَوْمُ, and then what will make you know what is Yawmuddin? And in the very last verse, he defines it. He says, يَوْمَ لَا تَمْلِكُ نَفْسٌ لِنَفْسٍ شَيْئًا, the day when no nafs, no soul, will tamliku shay'an, will own or control anything for any other soul. So the day when no soul will control or own anything else for any other soul. But the word that I'm translating as like control or own is the word tamliku, from the root word malaka, which is the same root word as Fatiha when we say Maliki Yawmuddin. He's the master or the owner of the day of ad-deen. So when we put these together, now we can see why he used the word Malik. Why did he use the word Malik? Because if we relate that to here, to 82:19, he says, it's the day when no soul will own or control anything for another soul. So he is the Malik, meaning he owns and controls everything on that day. Any benefit, any harm, he owns and controls everything on that day. No soul will own and control anything else. Wal amru, so at the end he says, Wal amru yawma idhin lillah. Yawma la tamliku nafsun li nafsin shay'a. Wal amru yawma idhin lillah. the day when no soul will own or control anything for another soul. And the amr, the command, the affair on that day is for Allah. That right there is the definition of Maliki Yawmiddin, the owner of Yawmuddin, the one who al-amru yawma idin lillah. On that day, all of the command or affair is for Allah. So this is also a really good example of how the Quran explains itself, as we always talk about. So those are the 13 times that the phrase Yawmuddin is mentioned, and that's why some people, from an Arabic standpoint, when they define the word deen, they also say it means al jaza'u wal mukafa'a. It means to be recompensed for something. That's why sometimes the phrase Yawmuddin they translate it as the day of recompense, the day when you will be recompensed or be given back based upon what you did, right? And that goes back to potentially, and Allah knows best, some of the root meanings of the word deen and connected to the word dain, debt, which means you're bound to certain obligations. And then the consequences come about based upon whether or not you adhere to those obligations. So Yawmuddin is the day of being recompensed based upon the deen, in a broader sense, not deen like in a very limited sense how people use it, but the deen in general, meaning the laws and the principles that Allah has given humanity to live by, whether the laws in his universe or the moral laws. And Allah knows best. So I think that's, it's almost 4, so I think that's a good summary for the day. If anybody has any follow-up questions or comments or thoughts, now would be a good time.
No, thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Nobody? If not, that's cool. That means that either means it was a really good class and I did good, or I put you to sleep. But either way, we got something out of it. No, I'm just kidding. Well, with that said,